Welcome to another lecture of Psychology 101. This is your instructor, Dr. Shadi Bashai. And in today's lecture, we will continue talking about social psychology. In specific, we will be discussing the second portion of this unit on social psychology, which corresponds to chapter 13 of your textbook. So here we go. I'll open today's lecture by giving you a very brief history lesson. And I'll tell you a little bit about a horrific event that happened in the 1960s, the My Lai massacre happening in Vietnam. In 1968, a group of heavily armed American soldiers descended on a Vietnamese village, and horrifically they killed 500 unarmed men, women, and children. While on trial, the commander of that particular troop was asked, "Why did you do it?" To which he simply responded, "We were just following orders." The My Lai massacre is a stark example of when blind obedience makes people behave in wrong and sometimes inhumane and violent ways. Blind obedience to authority figures has played a very key role in a number of atrocities in history, including things like the Holocaust. Blind obedience also contributed to things like medical errors and airplane disasters. And I will give you this particular quote, which highlights how dangerous blindly following authority can be. And this is a quote by C.P. Snow. "When you look at the dark, gloomy history of man, you will find that more hideous crimes have been committed in the name of obedience than in the name of rebellion." Today's lecture is about obedience. And obedience is defined as a type of social pressure that is applied vertically. That is, in the previous lecture, we discussed the concept of conformity. And that's when you go along with pressures from your peers, people who you don't see as an authority figure. Obedience, on the other hand, is when you follow or you go along with someone who you perceive as holding a position of authority, or as somebody who is in a position to give you commands, for example. Obedience can flow from an authority figure that is not necessarily legally or institutionally holding a position of power. So just as long as you perceive that person to be an authority or in a position of authority, then obedience can actually ensue. So this lecture will focus on discussing perhaps the most infamous set of experiments ever conducted in psychology, and that's the Stanley Milgram obedience studies. Stanley Milgram is actually a student of Solomon Asch, and if you remember who Solomon Asch is, Solomon Asch is the researcher who did all the work on conformity, which we discussed in the previous lecture. And that's the set of studies with the lines that we discussed in the very last lecture that we did. Milgram was of, Stanley Milgram that is, was of Jewish descent. He grew up witnessing the horrors of the Holocaust. Milgram was completely baffled, if you will, by the events of World War II and the Holocaust specifically. And what was so striking to Milgram was the idea of why so many seemingly very ordinary German men and women could be persuaded to act in such a horrific way, as was the case with the Holocaust. Milgram was very much inspired by a Jewish thinker and philosopher by the name of Hannah Arendt. And Arendt, in her writing, discussed something called The Banality of Evil, in which she explained that even the most horrific acts can actually be carried out by very ordinary, very average, non-psychopathic people. And these people are often, according to Hannah Arendt's philosophy, these people are often influenced to carry out their acts by somebody who is holding a position of authority, somebody who has some kind of influence over these people, okay? Which sets up the Milgram experiments fairly nicely here. So imagine with me, it's the year 1962, and you open your local newspaper, and you see this ad in your local newspaper. This is the actual newspaper advertisement for the Stanley Milgram obedience experiments. As the ad instructs, you show up to the psychology laboratory in the prestigious Yale institution, and you are immediately greeted by a researcher who is wearing a gray lab coat. The researcher thanks you for your interest in taking part in the study and begins to describe the study for which you just volunteered. And he explains to you that this is a study about learning. So you are immediately, or almost immediately, introduced to another volunteer and told that the pair of you will work together on understanding the nature of punishment in learning. And for this reason, and based on a coin toss, one of you will take the role of a teacher in the experiment, while the other volunteer will be the student or the learner. And again, it's all, at least as far as you're concerned, all determined by a coin flip. So you are then told that the student or the learner will be tasked with remembering word pairs, while the teacher is responsible basically for administering electric shocks of increasing intensity every time the learner fails to get the answer right. So the coin is flipped, and you learn that you will be the teacher in the experiment, and the other volunteer will be the learner or the student. And the research in the lab coat directs both of you to an adjacent room where the learner is, or the student in the experiment, is strapped into a shock plate and given instructions on how to answer the questions. So as a teacher, your job is to increase the shock level with every wrong answer provided by the learner. At one point of the experiment, the learner yells from the adjacent room and starts telling you that they have a heart condition and that their heart is starting to bother them given the shocks that you're administering. Every time you think of stopping, the researcher in the lab coat who is sitting behind the teacher in this particular experiment, the research tells you that it's important for you to go on. It's important for the sake of the study that you continue. Okay? The yelling in the next room eventually goes silent. And that's when when the teacher reaches about 345 volts. Turns out the other quote-unquote volunteer in the experiment, the student, that is, the learner, is a confederate of the study. He's an actor who is in on the entire thing. Also turns out that the study is rigged so that you're always the teacher. So the participants in the study are always the teachers. So they're always the ones who are administering the shocks as punishment for when the learner doesn't get it right. And the student is, in fact, giving the wrong answers purposely. And it also turns out that the student learner doesn't actually ever get or feel the shocks. because as soon as you move your head away from the adjacent room and go back to the original room where you first met, the student slips out as soon as the experiment starts and is quickly replaced by a pre-recorded audio recording. So at this point of the study, you are administering shocks to a supposed student or learner who at least keeps getting the answers wrong. And as far as you understand, the study is about the effects of punishment on learning. But the actual point of the study was to examine how many people would go on to administer the shocks with increasing intensity all the way to the very end of the spectrum of intensity, if you will, on that shock generator. So how many people would go on to potentially harm another individual just because they're being told to do so by somebody who appears to be an authority figure, namely the researcher? And Milgram was very smart, because what he did before the study was that he told a bunch of psychiatrists the design of his experiment. Obviously told them what the true purpose of the experiment was. And he had the psychiatrists who were predicting or that he's showing the study design to, he had them all predict how many people from his sample would go on to administer the shocks in their fullness all the way to the end. And most of the psychiatrists who were doing these predictions based their estimates on the base rate of psychopathic individuals in the population, which is not a lot. Okay, so in fact, a lot of them predicted about 0.1% of his sample, which is, if 1,000 people, one of them will go on to administer all the shocks in the experiment. But here's what Milgram actually found. 62% of his sample went on to administer the entire shock all the way to the end here. Okay. So 62% went all the way to the very end of the spectrum of intensity. And so that's, just so you know, that's more than 450 volts here. And in fact, the very last lever here, which is associated with the administration of these shocks, says XXX extreme shock. So most of them went all the way to the end, but they did so very begrudgingly. And most of the participants were actually quite uncomfortable. They're laughing inappropriately and nervously throughout. But most did exactly what they were told. And after the experiment, when they were asked why they went all the way to the end and potentially caused someone else harm, a few of them said, well, I stopped, but the researcher made me do it. He made me do it. So people were basically saying what the commander in that My Lai massacre said, which is, I was just told to do this. This is what I was just told to do. So here's a graphical depiction. As I was mentioning, 62% of the sample went on to administer the full gamut of the shocks on this unsuspecting stranger when they were told to do so. And I want you to let that number sink in for a minute. Okay? 62% of the sample went on to administer possibly harmful shocks to somebody that they don't know, just because someone said it's important that you continue. And I would challenge you to stop the video when you are able to and watch these two embedded YouTube clips, which will show you. There's one of them is actually a Hollywood version of the Stanley Milgram obedience studies, and then the second one is actually a documentary about the study itself. Really fascinating stuff. So if you do get a chance, I invite you to stop the video and go watch these supplementary YouTube clips. So Milgram actually did a number of variations on this particular experiment, just to see the extent to which people followed orders. For example, there was one condition when there were no words heard from the learner on the other side of the wall. That is, in the original voice condition feedback, which is this particular row here. This is when you hear the learner on the other side saying that they have a heart condition and that their heart is starting to bother them. But in this particular condition, the one up top here, the first row, there is no verbal feedback coming from the other side of the wall. You can only hear pounding at one point, okay? And then the pounding goes away after a little bit. So in that particular condition, when there's no voice, 65% of the sample went on to administer the highest intensity shock. In the voice condition, which is the condition that I just told you about, this one right here, about 62% of the sample went on to administer the full shocks. It's another condition, a proximity condition, and this is when the learner and the teacher are actually in the same room together, so that the teacher who is administering the shocks can see the agony on the student or the learner's face. And in that particular condition, only 40% of the sample went on to administer the highest intensity of shocks. When the authority figure, namely the researcher, was not present in the room with the teacher and only gave them orders or instructions via telephone, the number of people going all the way to the end dropped to 30%. That's this condition here. Sorry, that's the telephone condition, which is right here. And in yet another condition, when the teacher, so the person administering the shocks, was required to actually hold the learner's hand on the shock plate as they're receiving the shocks, 30% of the sample went on to administer the highest levels of shock. So remember, this is them holding the hand of the student or the learner on the shock plate. 30% of that sample did it. Now, when there was a second experimenter or researcher, so a second authority figure, who appeared to disagree with the first authority figure, and he says, you know what, maybe it's not important for the study to keep going. 0% of the sample went on to administer the full shocks. Okay, so when there is some kind of disagreement, we get this lesson, of course, from Solomon Asch's conformity studies. When there's some kind of disagreement, it seems to hamper obedience, and obviously we talked about how that could actually hamper conformity as well. And then finally, Milgram and his colleagues were worried that maybe, just maybe, the prestigious affiliation that is Yale is creating a situation where obedience is more likely. So they ran a condition with all the affiliations related to Yale were removed. It was a pretty run-down office building is where they decided to run the experiment. And again, they removed all associations with Yale University. And in that particular condition, close to 50% of the sample went on to administer the full shocks. There's also a YouTube clip that is embedded here, and again, that's the Hollywood edition of the Stanley Milgram experiments. Again, I challenge you to stop the video when you can and watch the supplementary YouTube clip here. Again, it supplements the ideas that I've been discussing. So there are key themes that emerge from this interesting set of studies by Milgram. The first is the greater the psychological distance between the teacher or the person who's actually inflicting the harm or the pain and the researcher, so the greater the psychological distance between them, or the person who's giving the harmful commands and the person administering the harms, the lower the levels of obedience. Okay. Secondly, the greater the psychological distance between the teacher and the learner, or the person being shocked or getting the pain, the higher the levels of obedience. Okay, so the greater the psychological distance between the person carrying out the harmful actions and the person giving these commands, the less obedience. The greater the psychological distance between the victim and the person carrying out the commands, the larger the obedience turns out. And in that particular last one, so the greater the psychological distance between the teacher and the learner, the victim, the more obedience. I want you to consider that in light of remote military technology, such as targeted drone attacks, for example, which really can be launched thousands of miles away over unsuspecting targets. Turns out there are a number of individual differences that makes an impact on, or at least predict, levels of obedience that somebody will display. So, for example, in the latter stages of moral development, so if you remember Kohlberg's theory of moral development, which talks about 3 stages of moral development, if people are in the last stage of moral development, namely the post-conventional morality stage, they are less likely to obey authority figures. By contrast, people who are higher on a trait called authoritarianism, which is this belief in a hierarchical world where subordinates need to follow orders. As you can probably imagine, people higher on this particular trait, named authoritarianism, are also more likely to obey a person in a position of power, position of authority. Okay? And finally, the results of Milgram's study, for example, were replicated in a number of cultures with both men and women. And it looks like, for the most part, the effects hold across different cultures and across genders. So these replications that were created in different cultures and on men and women, they're showing us really that there are no true gender differences or cross-cultural differences in the likelihood of people obeying authority figures. So, of course, Milgram's experiments, they're not without their criticisms. And perhaps one of the biggest criticisms coming from an ethical perspective. Okay? And here's the question that is posed. Was the study design and the level of deception involved, were these things ethical, in your opinion? There is a tension between 2 facts here. First fact, if people were told about the true nature of the experiment, that in fact the researchers were interested in studying the effects of obeying an authority figure, that they would likely alter their behavior in some way to invalidate the results of the study. The second fact, many of the participants in the study found it very psychologically, very distressing to be part of this study. As mentioned, many reactions of participants were recorded, and many showed nothing short of this psychological agony as they felt the tension between the orders that they were receiving from this particular authority figure, namely the researcher, and the clear agony of the victim next door. Okay, so their moral and ethical compasses were really telling them not to harm, but they're still receiving these messages from somebody whom they deem as an authority figure, telling them they need to keep going, that it's important for the study that they keep going. So the last fact is very powerful in the sense that this study was so distressing to individuals, would put them in such a a very, very strong, distressing ethical bond, that it is very unlikely that the study or a study like Milgram would ever be approved by an ethical body today. Another big criticism against the study is that even though all of these people, 62% in that classic example, went on to administer the full shocks in Milgram's paradigm, this may not be a good analogy to what happened in the Holocaust, and may not be a good analogy to more recent atrocities, such as the My Lai massacre. And some critics believe that you still need a few truly evil or sadistic individuals to carry out heinous crimes such as the Holocaust or the My Lai massacre. So the results of the Milgram study really leaves a bad taste in our mouths when it comes to understanding the true nature of humanity. It really makes us question the assumption that people are inherently good. So what is it? Are we good or are we evil? I think most people would tell you that human beings are capable of both good and evil. And in fact, research with chimpanzees, who share about 98% of our genetics, the research with chimps really paints a very clear picture about the capacity for primates to do both good and evil. So deep within us are tools and drives to act pro-socially or anti-socially. And pro-social behavior here is defined as any kind of behavior that is intended to help someone in some way, while antisocial behavior is any behavior that is intended to harm others, including things like aggressive acts. So if you read news headlines from the last 24 hours alone, you will see that people are very much capable of displaying both types of pro-social and antisocial behavior. We opened our discussion of social psychology with a discussion of the murder of Kitty Genovese. The story of her last day on Earth involves 13 witnesses who watched as she was brutally murdered, and they did not, unfortunately, at all come to her rescue or call the police. And there are various stories just like this one. In the 1990s in Detroit, a woman by the name of Dalitha Ward was brutally taunted and assaulted. And to escape this brutality, Dalitha jumped off a bridge and ultimately to her death. This was happening while 40 people stood by and did nothing at all to stop this horrific scene from unfolding. Similarly, the story of Brianne Voth, so this is very close to home because this happened in Vancouver, Canada. So this is the story. Brianne Voth is about, again, somebody who failed to receive much needed support from 3 neighbors who heard her scream during the events that caused the end of her life. So social psychologists have named this reduced likelihood to intervene in times of trouble when there are other people around. So they name this the bystander intervention effect, sometimes called the bystander non-intervention effect. The bystander effect is when you see someone in need of help, but you fail to help them just because of the mere presence of other people in that particular situation. The bystander effect can be explained through 2 particular mechanisms, the first of which is called pluralistic ignorance. And more importantly, there's another mechanism which we will discuss called diffusion of responsibility, and we will briefly discuss each of these. Pluralistic ignorance is when you secretly believe something about a social situation, for example, but then you end up rejecting your own beliefs because you look around and you don't see that others share in your belief or your interpretation about that particular social event. So let's make it more concrete. When you see someone who appears to be needing help, but you look around to see what everybody else is doing in that same situation, only to find that nobody's acting, then you start thinking that maybe, just maybe, your initial read of that situation is incorrect. That maybe, just maybe, the person who you perceive as needing help doesn't actually need your help because nobody's coming to the rescue. Obviously, we need to interpret the situation correctly before we can act. And pluralistic ignorance makes us more likely to misread the situation and reject evidence even from our own eyes. Research actually shows us that pluralistic ignorance is a very powerful factor that shapes our views and our behaviors. For example, there are studies about college students who almost always assume that other college students like them are more okay or more accepting of drinking than the stats actually tell us. So everyone just assumes to know what everybody else must be thinking or must believe about a particular topic or situation. The bystander non-intervention effect also works through another mechanism, and that mechanism is called diffusion of responsibility. Let's say we correctly interpret the situation as dangerous and correctly identify that the victim in this situation is truly in need of help. This belief still has to turn into an action somehow. So we still have to believe that part of the responsibility falls on us to intervene or to act in this particular situation. That is, when we're surrounded by people in an emergency situation, most people just pass the buck. So they kind of play a game of tag, if you will. Tag, you're it. And more importantly, in the case of diffusion of responsibility, they say tag, I'm not it. So when there are others around in an emergency situation, we just don't feel as responsible about not helping. That's just how it is, unfortunately. The bystander non-intervention effect has been shown time and time again in a series of classic experiments. In one experiment, participants waiting to take part in the study unexpectedly witnessed smoke that filled up the waiting area of that particular laboratory. If there was no one around but the participant, people were much more likely, and this is this particular study, people were much more likely to report that there is smoke than when they were waiting in that waiting area alone and they witnessed the smoke. Okay, and similarly, compared to when people were in the midst of or surrounded by others, they were much more likely than they were on their own to come to the rescue or help a woman who was clearly in distress. And again, these are the differences between people when they were alone. This is actually responding to the emergency. People were alone versus people in a group. And then finally, same effects over another variation on that study, which is coming to the rescue or the aid of somebody who appears to be having a seizure. Again, people were much more likely to act in this particular emergency situation when they were alone versus when they were surrounded by other people. Okay? I want you to take the next few minutes, if you will, to watch the embedded YouTube clip. And this particular YouTube clip is about the bystander intervention effect. And it'll show you some hidden camera evidence, if you will, of this very real social effect in action. Until next time.